Have you ever wondered how Jordan Peterson deals with being attacked? How he felt during the tundra of conflict, contradiction and controversy that surrounded him? On my podcast, Under the Skin, Jordan Peterson and I met for our third or fourth conversation and asked him directly how he feels when he knows that his beliefs have provoked or upset people. How he feels as a man who is compassionate when he knows that things he said have antagonized people, whether that's people in the media or ordinary people. It's a fantastic conversation. It's very interesting and beautiful to watch Professor Peterson's views evolve and change as the culture that we live in evolves and changes around us. Please watch this part of the conversation from my Luminary podcast, Under the Skin. Stay to the very end. It's fantastic. And I really want to know what you think about it and what it provoked in you. So stay with me.
Like, I can imagine a version of you when you become you're open-hearted. It's clear you're becoming more and more open-hearted. It seems like that in a kind of almost spiritual or religious sort of way. I wonder how you might approach those people that no doubt had a bit of an axe to grind. I'm speaking in particular of the Helen Lewis conversation or the Channel 4 one. You know, when you come against people that clearly have a little bit of a takedown mentality. Do you think
it's hard not to get defensive?
Impossible.
It's not impossible, but it's hard. It's really hard. And the Helen Lewis interview in particular, I was sitting in the room that she was in with her photographers. There was a photography session first, and it was icy cold in there in a psychological sense, in that icy cold manner that you get when you walk into a room and you know that there's something underneath the carpet, and I'm very sensitive to that sort of thing. And so I was like a cat with my hair up already by the time the interview started. I was also extremely tired at the time. And so I was much more defensive than I could have been optimally. And that was partly also because in an interview like that, part of what's hoped for, I suppose, is that the person being so grilled will slip up in some, remarkable manner that's instantly viral. And that redounds to the credit of the takedown artist and is like it's a permanent stain on the reputation of the person so affected. And so, it's a very fine line to walk. And it's hard to do it exactly right.
Does that dynamic mean to you that you find it's impossible to yield or be sympathetic or be open or loving? Because I've been in that situation.
Well, it's harder for sure. It's harder for sure to remember when you're being, let's say, attacked, or when what the person assumes you think is being attacked and is projecting that on you. It's much harder to love your enemy under such circumstances. And you might even say, well, why should I even bother? This person is trying to take me down. And so, why should I care for them? And the reason for that is, well, do you really want enemies? And do you really want people to suffer more than they have to, including the people who think they're opposed to you? And if you have any sense, the answer to that is definitely no. And, that's part of that no vindication issue as well. So you don't want that. You want to have a conversation. You want to get past the ideology to the person. And I did object to her at one point, the GQ interview, and said, I'd rather talk to you than to this devil of ideology that's possessing you, because you would be much more interesting than all this predictable verbal, what would you call it, puppetry that you're manifesting. And, that didn't work, and unfortunately, and that's partly my fault, but c'est la vie. I'm doing my best.
But now that now we're in a different situation where I suppose am inviting comment in some of the areas that might have been covered in those more combative situations, but I hope, bear those biases certainly in the same way. Do you feel that underlying these attacks there is something valid, truthful and real in the people that have made those claims?
Absolutely.
What is it?
Oh, there's all sorts. Let's talk about the left in general. We all are part of identity groups. So the question about what role our group identity plays in our identity and what role respect for that should play in the polity at large, that's certainly something that's always open for discussion. I believe that the reason that free speech, for example, has to be the primary virtue, let's say, primary value, is because free speech is indistinguishable from thought. And thought is indistinguishable, especially thought done socially, which is more sophisticated thought because many brains are actually smarter than one. Plus, we think in words, and so there's a huge social element to thought. And we don't only think in words. And so thought is literally the process by which consciousness makes adjustments to our presumptions. And so since we're all error prone, no matter who we are, because the future is different than the past, then if we don't make free speech and the role consciousness plays in using that to adjust our presuppositions central, we all stagnate and things fall apart. And that's ancient wisdom as well as, I would say, modern clinical wisdom. I mean, I just went down to Bucknell University and did a talk on free speech as a precondition for mental and social health. And I picked that title very carefully. And, one of the things that's quite striking about clinical practice in psychiatry and psychology, independent of the pure medical end, the medication end, is that all the great clinicians, regardless of their school of thought, agreed that free speech accompanied by intense listening was psychologically and physiologically transformative. Well, okay, so what do you do with a discovery like that, let's say? And I would say, well, if that's not a scientific discovery, it's very close to it. Depends on how scientific you think clinical practice is. And it's complex because it's kind of like engineering in that it's a practical discipline. It's not pure science. But still, that agreement across schools of psychotherapeutic endeavor is striking. And it's meaningful, and it's much in accordance with how we understand the function of the brain and its evolution as well, because we human beings are unique in that we produce abstracted representations of the world and our actions in the world. Those are stories, let's say, before we implement those in action. And so we can test out the utility and validity of the abstracted patterns and representations before we act them out and die because we're wrong. And so that's evolution. That's the taking of evolution to the next step. And I mean that technically, because the forces of selection operate at the level of abstraction for human beings. And you interfere with that when you interfere with free speech. And so let's give the devil his due. Well, what about words that hurt people's feelings? Isn't that bad? Well, yes, of course. Like, who wants people's feelings hurt? But that's not a sophisticated argument because it doesn't take into account time frame. You know perfectly well that there are things you have to do right now that are difficult and challenging and even hurtful to yourself because of their stress that if you don't attend to will cause immense trouble and grief not too much later. And we all know that all the time. And so the simple and unthinking compassion that drives statements like, well, don't be judgmental, which is also something worth looking into in great depth, it's just nowhere near developed enough to be of practical utility, and it actually interferes with what's higher than that. So, and I would say as well, clinically, that was first observed in some sense by Freud with his emphasis on the catastrophic consequences of the Oedipal family, where the desire to protect based on compassion and also fear to some degree, fear particularly on the mother's part of being alone, meant an all-embracing compassion that was so great that it interfered with the development of independence. And so that becomes, well, pathological in its own right. And there's very little observation on the radical compassionate left of the fact that compassion itself is by no means the only virtue or the highest virtue, or that it doesn't have a devouring and pathological side, which it absolutely does. So, and that doesn't mean compassion is without merit. Obviously, it has its merits, but it has to be placed properly.
It's interesting to reflect and consider how those pathologies may map onto a broader or larger social scale, how that devouring, fanged, enveloping anaconda compassion may bind us and wrap us up.
Well, what did you think of that conversation? Do you think I approached Professor Peterson correctly? Are you a fan of Jordan Peterson, generally speaking, or is he someone that causes you to feel antagonized, challenged, confronted? Let me know in the comments below. Your opinions are much more important than mine. Give us a thumbs up, subscribe to this channel, and turn on the notification bell. If you enjoyed this video, have a look at this one. It's equally good. And please consider subscribing to my side channel, Awakening with Russell Brand, where I talk about personal development, well-being, and give techniques around breathing and meditation that are going to make you feel better and equip you better to deal with the crazy world we're living in. Please sign up to my mailing list so I can tell you exactly what I'm up to, what I'm reading, who I'm thinking about, what I'm doing right now. And if you're available to come and see me next year, you should, because between January and May, I'm performing all over the UK. Stay free.